Tusind tak. Hi. And that is the end of my Danish capability. So it's really great to be back in Denmark, actually. I spent 2 years doing research with Jens Christian in Aarhus and really enjoyed that, so it's fantastic to be back, and I really appreciated the invitation from Magnus. When I got the invitation, I was writing a book chapter, trying to summarize some of the work I've been doing in Britain and how we might rewild Britain. And I was trying to think about how to describe what the book chapter covered, because it was getting far too long, and generally lots of people have input and different ideas about what rewilding is. So we started off with a bit of theory, and then I've been working a little bit on wolf population modelings and how virtual rewilding can try and inform us about how things might work in reality. And then I've also done some experimental rewilding with some wild boar up in the Scottish Highlands. So I'm going to try and tell you about as much of that as I can over the next 15-20 minutes or so. Okay, so as I'm sure most of you are aware, the initial concept of rewilding was built around large core areas, connectivity between them, and keystone species. And Sewell and Noss particularly said large predators. I think that was mainly in the context of where they were talking about, which is in North America. And I think the keystone species element is particularly interesting for rewilding. And I also think it's the one that requires a bit more discussion, and also brings the other two into context, i.e. what is large? Large is a difficult concept, large according to what? And I think it's in the context of the species and the communities you're trying to restore or rewild that the importance of large becomes relevant. Instead of using keystone species, I tend to talk about community reassembly to restore ecosystem function. This is to restore the natural processes that drive how the dynamics of an ecosystem. And I fear sometimes when talking about keystone species, people get particularly excited by their species or species they work on or species they're particularly keen to see back. At the same time, I think people get very worried about the implications of some species from a social point of view. And I put the wolf up here partly because it's a species I'm interested in, but also generates such a crazy set of emotions from really representing the wild to a considerable amount of fear. And I think what's really important about it from an ecological perspective, and I think this is where rewilding should start, is we're not so worried about putting the wolf back in. The wolf's not doing too badly as a species. It's probably not our major priority in terms of rare species. But it's the interactions that the wolf has with the rest of the system that's important. And what's important then is to think what species are currently in the system, because if you put the wolf back, it makes a big difference depending on what is already there and present. If you put the wolf into Yellowstone, you've got a fairly intact system over there. If you put it into Scotland, you possibly less so. There's different things taking place. So it's in the context of that community that I think is important how we think about rewilding. So in terms of what rewilding is then, I think community assembly rules is a useful concept within ecology that we can think about how we might achieve certain things with rewilding. And the idea of community assembly rules, if we look at the middle column, we start off with a total species pool. This is all the species that exist on the planet. So we have quite a few to choose from, but if we're trying to take that from that global perspective down to what species you find at a local site, your rewilding project site. So we start off with any of those species in the globe could potentially be at your local rewilding project, but we have some dispersal filtering. Species that are in South America currently are unlikely to get to Scotland anytime soon, depending on their dispersal abilities, obviously. So that limits the species pool down a little bit in what's called the geographic species pool. Once you have a geographic species pool, the environmental conditions within that area then will play an important role about what species can actually survive on your rewilding project site. And this is, again, important with rewilding because we tend to try and think about very long timescales, and what may have been present 100 or 1,000 years or more in the past is not necessarily the conditions today. The species you actually lost in the past might have affected the environmental conditions you have currently, which is important to think about. And then so that gives you your habitat species pool, so this might be your regional, this might be the whole of the Scottish Highlands, all the species that can occur there. If we then look at a landscape, your probably finest scale from a rewilding perspective, we then need to think about what species are currently in that landscape and how they interact with each other. This is like the internal dynamics, ecosystem dynamics. So we have depending on what predators you have in place and whether your mutualists are there and whether you're being outcompeted by better competitors, there's a lot to consider within your system, within your ecosystem dynamics. So that's kind of our natural process. We kind of consider humans to either be part or slightly separated from the system. We certainly change the dynamics of the way many of these ecosystems work, and we can do this at all levels. So the species extinction, if we completely remove them from the species pool, they cannot disperse anymore. They cannot enter your system. And I think the famous one we generally talk about, rewilding, which Jens Christian's already touched upon, or gone into quite a lot of detail, is the Pleistocene late Quaternary extinction. That removed a large number of species from your total species pool. Then you can talk about human dispersal barriers, and I often think about, over the last 10,000 years, where would Asian elephants be today if they hadn't been getting smaller and smaller in range, and they could have been expanding. Maybe they were at their limit, but it also could have been potentially much further if you think about where species have got to in the past over the last interglacial period. So we're putting limits on dispersal, and I think that's important to think about in terms of, rather than thinking about where species are or where they've been historically, where they were in the where they would be in the future is an equally interesting question. Obviously, we have big impacts on how the environment works, and obviously climate change is going to have some significant impacts as well. And I really better hurry up. So I'm going to skip, but we can also, from a rewilding point of view, that we can then take actions against these actions. We can talk about taxon substitution, replacing species by finding very similar functional species. So straight-tusked elephant, is the Asian elephant going to do a similar role? We can talk about species reintroductions, and we can restore environmental conditions and features, and we can rewild the internal dynamics by looking about how we impact species numbers and try and remove that. And I think this looks something a bit like this. So at the top slide, wow, I'm really going to run over. We have a natural ecosystem dynamics, and this is the way it all functions. We can remove species, we can change the environmental conditions, and we can remove it into a reduced stable state. And that's shown at the top. But equally, we can look at a sequence of reintroductions that may improve the environmental conditions and internal dynamics, which will allow more species to come, and we can try and move it from an impoverished ecosystem dynamics to a richer system. So I think what's really important is to look at what species to fill what functional guilds, and what sequence can we put them back in to restore all the dynamics we want of the system. So going on to Scotland in particular, I started with this slide because there's very little of this actually left in Scotland. We chopped down quite a large amount of forest. We also had some climate change which reduced the forest cover, but right now we have maybe a semi-natural forest or ancient woodland. We have about 1% maybe of what it was. And people talk about restoring particular habitats, but I think that's important in context to say we're very limited on woodland, but our actual aims for the ecosystem is one that's self-sustaining. We don't necessarily want, this kind of the open-ended conservation. We ideally want a system that creates the internal dynamics that supports all the systems over the landscape or regional scale. We probably one that's high in biodiversity. I think rewilding is part of that and has an aim to look after the biodiversity. I think we'd be upset if we rewilded and found out we lost a lot of species. And humans are part of the system, undoubtedly, and we need to think about the ecosystem services that's providing and the people that are currently living in the system. So from the Scottish Highlands point of view, I think there are a number of processes we need to think about. Things like seed source, as I say, we've chopped down a lot of trees. Some species in particular have been heavily hit, so maybe not part of the species pool anymore. So we need to think about, well, if you lose your seed source, you're going to lose your seed dispersers. Your germination niche, this is creating patches of bare ground for trees and other shrubs to get a chance to re-establish. Depends on how many large herbivores you have running around. Your predator-herbivore plant interactions, we have no big predators left in Scotland, which means we have a high herbivore abundance, and then any trees that do establish rapidly get chewed up. And then the soil dynamics is also important, which have changed without the presence of woodland. I'm going to skip past this one because Jens Christian's already shown it, but we know that large mammals we've had a big impact on large mammals, and they are missing. We've really changed the system from that point of view. And we know they're important, again, because of the work I've done with Jens Christian's already shown, that this is from beetle work in the UK, so we know that in the last interglacial that there seemed to be a higher herbivore abundance, and we had a greater mix of open and closed woodland habitats, whereas in the early Holocene, when we lost these species, with suppressing their numbers, we had higher forest cover. So in talking about community structure, I tried to sketch out some of the, from a mammal point of view, the species that we might, that we currently have and the ones that we could have. And I think we get something that looks a bit like this, where the greyed out boxes are extinct species from the UK. Some of them I've included because we could find taxonomic substitutions for them. Others I've excluded because I think they're pretty much gone. We can't really find something suitable. And what we have is a structure here. And the box in red in the middle is the one that's probably, the species in blue are non-native introductions, and they're not limited by a predator. So I think we have a very dominated system here by large predators. So there's two, this is the area I want to talk about for the Scottish Highland in particular, and that is predator-herbivore plant interactions and the creation of germination niches provided by rooting and disturbance by wild boar. And the reason I've chosen these is because I happen to work on it. And I also think wolf is particularly important and the one I'm going to deal with first because it's a habitat generalist. It occurs pretty much, or has occurred pretty much in all habitats in the northern hemisphere. So we don't have to worry. As long as there's plenty of prey present, they seem to do all right. And as I said, there's a lot of prey present in the Scottish Highlands. So they're a good place to start. And also a lot of other species that are important for woodland dynamics, your boars and your beaver, often require woodland to be there already. So we're hoping that maybe our wolf system can change the dynamics of the system, encourage a bit more woodland regeneration, which create a system that's more suitable for things like boar and beaver, which can add richness to your system overall and create those disturbance dynamics. So we had a couple of key questions. I get asked a lot, but is there really space in the UK for large predators? You know, surely there's too many people. And I'm also going to take this from a fence point of view because the social dynamics, we're not in a situation of Denmark where wolves are very unlikely to get back to Britain by themselves. They're going to need to be reintroduced. So how do we change that perspective? And a fence reserve is one idea that's been put forward. And then can wolves really impact the deer population in Scotland? So. This is where I used to work in the red. I don't know if this works. No. The red in the top corners is where I used to work. So very northern tip of Scotland. This brown area in the middle is called the Allerdale Estate, owned by a guy called Paul Lister, who's interested in creating this fence reserve idea. I used to live up here for. I lived up here for about 5 years, and I lived right in the middle of it. There's a beige circle. Which was my house for a couple of years. It's pretty isolated. Just for context, it's one of the I can't show you very well, but one of the next nearest inhabited building is 10 kilometres away via dirt track, and you can see thousands of deer depending on time of year and the season between that. And I probably should include a photo, but it's what's described as a deer desert up there because although you have a little bit of remnant woodland, you drive out in your 10 kilometres, and it's a beautiful countryside and it's very popular with tourists. But at the same time, it is a system that's been entirely impoverished by human activities. I used to live on Glen Moor, which is a valley that has been described a few hundred years ago as having the finest trees, the tallest conifers in Scotland, which just don't exist anymore. So we want to think about the fact that that's getting continually smaller through greater and heavier grazing. So we tried to look at an area to see how big an area was, and we found that 1,500 square kilometres is quite a big space, and that doesn't cut off any tarmac roads. It includes 36 buildings, most of which aren't inhabited, and that's those beige areas in the middle. And it seemed like a reasonable area that we could start talking about wolf reintroduction. Looking at the suitability, I'm just going to skip over this a little bit. Looking at suitability for wolves is all about looking at the social and the community side of it. So we know that people like to visit high points, the Munros in Scotland, and these red areas represent those high points, which have a high human traffic. We don't necessarily want to put a fence up and create those problems. So, but in general, the area is not too unsuited for wolves. There's a high prey density over this whole area. So we did some modelling, and we wanted to work out what impact might wolves have on deer. And this simply shows that setting up a variety of modelling environments, you need to get over a threshold density of wolves to really have a strong impact on deer. So if we look at the bottom, we have a maximum wolf density recorded over a 100-year period in our modelled environment, and unless you get over a density under our modelling conditions of around 80 wolves per 1,000 square kilometres, you don't have an opportunity to have an impact on the deer population. Up the side, on the y-axis, we have minimum deer density. So it started off around 20 per square kilometres, and as you can see, as we move up to the right, it can reduce dramatically if the wolves get on top of it. So we talked about fenced areas, and I think the important things talking about fenced areas and the concept we were thinking about is we have this idea of protected areas in Europe, or in fact most of the world. We have protected areas and we have non-protected areas, and the system and the conditions within those areas are quite different. So what we might find in a protected area, or we might expect, is natural ecosystem dynamics. But what I was thinking about is maybe source sink population dynamics. So if we have predators in a protected area, they're doing all right. They're getting up reasonably high density. But then dispersing animals that are off looking for the territories of their own, and they're looking for mates, they're going to wonder, they think, well, there's pretty high density of wolves in here. Maybe this is not the best place for me to look. I'll just nip over a border that I can't see or interpret, and I'll go find there's very few wolves over here, but there's still plenty of prey. And what you might find is they're wandering off into areas where they are more likely to be shot or killed by people, and that might create that system where we have a high number of dispersing animals moving from within a protected area to outside a protected area, and reducing the maximum density you can achieve within your protected area. So we looked at this concept of boundary permeability, which is basically to say, if we remove, so along the bottom here, we can remove either 0% of the dispersing animals or 100% of the dispersing animals. And again, we find an interesting threshold. So again, if you remember, the maximum wolf density is important. That's up the side. We can see that if the social dynamics of wolves prevent the pack density getting too high, represented by the blue crosses, then we don't ever get to that density. The wolf social interactions prevent high wolf density. If we allow that pack density to get higher, but we don't have too strong. We can lose up to maybe 35% of dispersing animals and not really limit the maximum density of the wolves. But if we start getting over that density, then we're going to have an impact on the maximum density of wolves, and so their ability to impact deer. And I think this is useful to try and set some boundaries to understand humans' impacts on the internal dynamics of predator-prey interactions. This is also important in terms of timescales. This is to say how long does it take for a wolf to get up to maximum density, depending on different losses of different numbers of dispersers. And it might take 20 years, or it might take quite a lot longer, 40, 50 years. So we're talking about quite a long time before we see a wolves really reducing deer population densities, depending on how good our model is. And we found it pretty good when comparing it to Yellowstone, but Yellowstone had quite strong impacts on the deer, on the elk numbers relatively quickly. But this virtual concept allows us to start thinking about these questions and try and work out what the key issues are. So moving on to the wild boar, and I'm going to have to keep this quite brief. We asked a number of questions about how wild boar might interact with the Scottish environment and how that might impact the dynamics, the habitat dynamics for woodland or vegetation community dynamics. So just quite simply, how fast do wild boar root? How big an area do they create? How much time do they spend rooting? How does it vary from season? How does it vary between habitat? I think where does it root? And do trees grow in those rooted areas? I think are the key questions that we were striving to answer. So we set up 9 enclosures. We put different densities of boar in, and we just simply worked out and measured how much rooting area they created per week. And we found reasonably consistent results per week, depending on how the climate was. So between week 6 and 7, you can see the rooting rate has shot up quite dramatically. And in that week, we had very high rainfall and created this nice soft area for them to root, and they were much more effective. And rooting has been associated with wet areas, so they seem to like that easy kind of area. So we kind of start to get a concept of how area that might root, but this is obviously, quite limited. It's quite relatively small enclosures under small densities, but getting an understanding of the kind of space and how they're interacting, or certainly the order of magnitude of their impact is quite important, we think. In terms of where do wild boar root? Well, this is actually we looked at a few questions around this, but in terms of season, we looked at how the amount of foraging activity they did, and they were much more active during the autumn and winter when they were probably stressed by the cold, wet thing. And I spent 6 hours a day following these boar around for quite a long time, and I can assure you it was wet and miserable and cold, and I can understand why they'd want to make sure they're maximising what they can eat. And we also found they changed their foraging habits depending on season as well, as you might expect, depending on how resources change. So during the autumn and winter, they spent most of their foraging time performing rooting behaviour. So they were digging up the roots, primarily of bracken, because the food resources in the enclosure weren't massively exciting for boar. They really like things like oak and beech mast. But when they weren't given that, they're quite adaptable, and they'll switch around to get their favourite source. But then as the grass comes through during the spring, they switch to that, and they stop rooting so much, and they switch to a more grazing behaviour. And in terms of, maybe if we want to use boar in terms of naturalistic rooting instead of naturalistic grazing, this could be useful in the way we deal with wild boar in farmed environments, and maybe moving them out into certain woodland areas during certain times of year. It's just another way of thinking about it. We know they have a big impact where they do root, and this is probably unsurprising. And looking at heather communities, and what we find basically there's a very strong difference. They create these big bare ground patches, and yeah, I'm going to skip over because I'm pretty much out of time. But the difference is quite dramatic from rooted to unrooted areas. But obviously, in terms of the landscape impact, depends on the density of boar you have and their ability to move around. So again, it's a community type idea. So do wolves have a future in Scotland? Well, Allerdale, the Paul Lister has come out with renewed vigour to try and get wolves back in the next 3 years. He's going to try a few different tactics, but he's going to need quite a big space. But there's some bold ambitions out there. But wolves and boar aren't the only important species. I just want to emphasise that. We need to think about all the dynamics, and certainly mammals aren't the only important group to think about. We also need to think about all the other communities as well. So there's a lot to get our teeth into. And I also want to think about what do we do about the species that we aren't likely to reintroduce anytime soon, because they deliver important processes. And this might be a problem for 100 years' time when woodland is expanding all over Scotland and becoming the new pest. And we might want to think about some elephants back then. So I just want to say thank you very much to all my co-authors and people who funded me, and you for listening as well. Thanks very much.
We take 5 minutes more. Yeah.
Sorry?
It's
yep.
nice.
I think I'm out of time. But.
No, it's nice. It's nice.
Okay.
Thank you to Chris for keeping inside the schedule. We have a couple of minutes of comments and questions. And please, if you have anything to ask, Chris, please tell us who you are and where you come from. Anybody? Any comments? Any questions? Yep.
My name is Sel, and I'm from Københavns Universitet.
And you have to yell, Michelle.
You mentioned that the wild would have a huge impact, but what sort of impact? Positive or negative with the biodiversity?
Yeah, so I was a bit rushed by that point. I think positive and negative is a very difficult concept to deal with, because if you take a wild boar population without any predators, when you've got all sorts of extra food sources through waste, and their population expands to very large densities, especially after a good seed year, and there's what you will find is at that density they'll have a really big impact kind of everywhere, and they'll start rooting up golf courses and football pitches and people's gardens, and that will be seen as a very negative impact. If you put them in a system which has a community that's very intact, you've got a big space and you've got natural processes, they'll disturb some areas and they'll leave other areas, and what you'll find is a positive biodiversity impact at the wider scale. So what we found was on a very site-based area, if the boar come in and root an area, obviously you lose all the vegetation, so you're just getting less biodiversity. They've rooted up and created bare ground. But what you find is a different community coming back afterwards, which is going to have, just providing that different opportunity, and it's going to provide a positive impact. So it depends on how you look at it.
Any more questions or comments? Yes?
I'm Kate from Københavns Universitet. How many rewilding projects exist in Scotland or in the UK? Is it many or few?
I think there's quite a few. Not all of them are talked about as rewilding projects, but they're taking rewilding type ideas. I'm involved with a group at the moment that's asking that exact question because no one has an exact answer, so we might do that research. But there are quite a few sites, and there are quite big landowners who are interested in the idea of rewilding. And the advantage of Scotland is you can buy big areas of land relatively cheaply for these guys. For most of us, not so much. Yeah.